This is the London FinTech Podcast, brought to you by your host, Mike Ballerman, bridging the worlds of suits and t-shirts, of finance and technology, bringing you insights, stories, and inspiration from the golden age of opportunity and innovation happening in London right now.
Hi, this is Mike Ballerman, and this is the London FinTech Podcast, episode 220, brought to you in association with Smart and thelistedboard.com, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Tristan Fletcher, founder of Chai, who are in the business of predicting commodity prices using clever computers. We first heard from Tristan, a long-term both academic and fintech in the whole AI-ML realm, way back in 2016, for an overview of the topic, which has remained in the top 5 most downloaded episodes of all time. He last joined us in 2019 again to discuss the current hot topics in AI-ML, which were in particular prediction, explicability, alternative data sources, and self-learning. 4 years later, we're thus well overdue a catch-up with Tristan, especially given the recent phenomenon that is ChatGPT, which has broken every tech record in the book for a business or piece of tech that has attracted users faster than any other tech in history. If ChatGPT has made mainstream news, then other generative AI systems, such as text-to-images with the likes of Midjourney, Stable Diffusion, and DALL-E 2, have caught the attention of more purely tech folk. LLMs, large language models, have the ability to absorb a ton of information and to get something useful out of it. According to NVIDIA, one of the main reasons driving this great success has been a factor of 10 improvement every year in recent years of processing. ChatGPT certainly makes, in comparison, Alexa and Siri look like single-celled life forms, not least of which with their ability to write code and spot bugs in code with a certain amount of decency. However, it hasn't just been bigger, faster computers that have led to this, but lots of clever, cloggy folks working in AI. And there are all sorts of things that the AI folk out there listening will know about and the other ones will not. Transformers, which are the T in GPT, a great leap forward from the so-called RNN model of neural networks. So-called self-attention, RLHF, reinforcement learning from human feedback. In the image space, we have the likes of GANs, generative adversarial networks, latent diffusion models, and so forth, as well as, in all cases, the clever use of efficiency gains. To give you an example of how the combination of new techniques and faster computers has leapt forwards, GPT-1 was released in 2018, GPT-2 in 2019, and GPT-3 in 2020, with its offshoot, ChatGPT, in 2022. Let's compare GPT-3 to GPT-2, which was released a year earlier. GPT-3 has 176 billion parameters, compared to a year earlier's 1.5 billion, and was trained on 570 gigabytes of data compared to 40 gigabytes. But this is just the sexiest, most currently hyped public face of AI-ML, which as a whole has been finally, one might say, actually getting somewhere. As we heard in LFP221, the ex-GCHQers at Ripjar have a database of 18 billion news articles which they can process, which seems quite a lot. Once one gets this scale of computing, then, even avoiding the unfortunate anthropomorphism implicit in terms like intelligence or learning that Tristan and I discussed back in the day, even if we simply revert to the old school term data processing, then we're finally getting to a stage where the results from data processing are, I believe, truly phenomenal. Even I have shifted to keeping track of the latest developments, having been pretty sniffy about the uber hype of a field that generally, over many decades, failed to achieve most of its initial objectives set out by pioneers in the 60s. Plenty to talk about, so let's get on with the show. Good afternoon, Tristan. Thank you for joining me on the show today.
Hello, Mike. It's nice to be back, third time. Nice to see you.
Yes, 4 years has flown, what with a few years of house arrest and other such excitement. So when we were chit-chatting beforehand, you being a busy founder, father, and all these kind of things, despite the fact that you're our leading expert on AI, unlike me who doesn't really have a proper day job, it turns out that you haven't spent, like, whatever it is now, 100 million or a billion people, I don't know. You haven't spent the last 2 months constantly sort of chatting up ChatGPT, curiously.
That's true. I've read a lot about ChatGPT, but I've never used it or any of its previous incarnations personally. But I am intrigued to have a go.
Yes, it's a very interesting phenomenon. I found by just playing around and using it, it's a very strange kind of system. I mean, on the downside, as no doubt you'll come and tell us in the main course, there is the slight downside that it's capable of hallucinating and talking complete bollocks and making no sense, which I guess if your day business involves predicting the commodity prices You don't really want systems that sort of can tell you that gold will be $1 million per ounce tomorrow, because that won't make your clients happy. But on the other side, especially in its sort of ChatGPT incarnation, I found it's actually remarkably helpful. And, to give an example, I'm not sure I mentioned in the last episode, where we're talking about monetary policy and the correlation between monetary policy and societal collapse and all that kind of stuff. I suggested to Mario, the guest, that he have a go. And I had a go as well at looking these things up. And before we kicked off, he said, "Oh, that ChatGPT, waste of time. Just, it's just conventional wisdom. It just tells you what everyone else says or something." Which I suspect is what you would get if you say to ChatGPT, "Tell me about gold and money." As ChatGPT is trained on, should we say, consensus of all the articles out there. Then if you ask it for that, it's that. But then, having played around much more with the prompting of ChatGPT to give it what you want, I said to it, "You're a dissident who doesn't believe that current monetary policy and central banks are the appropriate fashion. What are your main arguments, and who are the main authors who have referred those arguments?" And he goes, "Pfft." And then I say, "Okay, so tell me what von Mises' line was on monetary policy. In 250 words, he does that." And the end, I was saying, "Well, tell me the difference between von Mises, Rothbard, and Hayek's perspective on monetary policy." And astonishingly, for something which, as I understand, is basically a predictive text generator, just like in the same thing when you're typing a sentence on your phone or something, it'll give you the next word. It gave me astonishingly things. So I do know other people who have used it and said, "Oh, it's a load of rubbish." But like a lot of these things, but almost uniquely actually, I found that with this, compared to any other tool I've seen, you do have to learn how to dance with it. Because you can turn up, and if you don't dance the right way, they'll just say, "Oh, this thing only knows one dance," and it's sort of very rigid. And just talking podcasting, another example was, a former guest asked me if I could give some advice to his company, and they're starting a podcast. I said, "Sure," whatever. So he put me in touch. And one thing that I sort of hate in my dotage is just going through sort of the Ladybird book 1A of stuff, like the letter A and then there's the letter B and letter C. So I went to ChatGPT and said, "Give me 200 words of advice to people starting a new corporate podcast." And it gave me 6 points, which are really helpful. So I emailed the people back saying, "Sure, look, this is what ChatGPT told me in 30 seconds. Anything that's not in here or where you think it's wrong, let's talk about that." So I can then sort of stick more to masterclassy stuff. So yes, I found it actually quite fun. I actually quite like interacting with it in a way, because it's a challenge. It's a bit like one of these sort of it's almost like an AI game, really.
Yeah. As I said, I haven't really used it. My view of it, in terms of what you said, learning to dance with it, it's probably quite similar to when search engines first became popular, that people will have dismissed them, but they would have dismissed them because they weren't interacting with them in the way that they were designed. And now it's a skill that's quite pervasive, is how to Google something. It's even become a verb. And it's possible that, people get au fait with chat GPTing things, perhaps a more elegant description will be used, and it'll replace the ability to summarize text and the things it seems to me to do. But as far as I can tell from the outside, it looks like an incredibly intelligent way of summarizing huge amounts of information. I'm not going to say whether that means it's intelligent or not, but that to me seems to be the main use case. A bit like search engines were giving you information at your fingertips. And as per the point on hallucinations, I think that's one of the problems of generative AI altogether. And in fact, I deliberately stayed clear of generative AI quite early on in my career, because in practical terms, generative systems are quite hard to calibrate. They're quite hard to tie up to the real world. They're quite hard to initiate as well, to sort of set the scene when you don't have much information about how they're meant to evolve. And everything I've done right from the beginning has been in non-generative machine learning. It's about putting data in, learning associations of that data in a desired thing you're trying to predict or an outcome. Whereas generative AI doesn't have that. It can kind of sustain itself in the absence of the information from the outside world. So I've always steered clear of it, but clearly, in worlds like ChatGPT and some of the other generative AI things we're seeing, is pretty cool.
Yes, and I think the fact, there's the whole commercial angle of Microsoft versus Google, and the media, New York Times has started a huge hysteria about it, and Bing has now taken ChatGPT out of Bing, or has massively slashed back the ability to chat to basically ChatGPT or GPT 3.5 or 6 or something. via Bing after the New York Times fomented hysteria because someone had spoken to it and the program told him to leave his wife or something like that.
Wow.
Either that or he said, Putin wasn't solely responsible for the Ukrainian war or some nonsense like that. But that's a sort of a squeak from the globalist propagandists whose main aim in life is to have complete control over information and all that, and it's forgetting that something's a computer program. I mean, having watched a few of these AI channels actually this year, there are some of these things which are sort of quite sad, I find. One of which was some guy asking ChatGPT, says, you're a relationship counsellor. It's really important to provide context if you want useful stuff out of it, rather than generalities. And, you want to split up with your girlfriend, but you don't quite know how to put it. So all these Asperger's text folks sitting there like that. And it's, it gives it a scenario about picking a time and being sensitive and da-di-da-di-da-di-da-di. And one of the things that occurred to me with use cases like that or others, apart from the sort of the sad thing from a human perspective, that machines are making us all into machines, and younger folk who have grown up as babies, you see these terrible things with babies with iPads in their hand to keep them quiet in restaurants and stuff like that, is that people grow up with machines, become machines, and then they don't know how to do the human stuff. But the other thing that really occurs to me just by watching a few of these things is that one reason that something like ChatGPT can be a good relationship counsellor and can give you sensible advice is that, in McGill-Christian terms, everything is very left-brained, and also we've got this massive consensus around everything, I went to a talk recently about an entrepreneurial society, shall we say, and one of the corporate sponsors read a couple of paragraphs out and said, oh, by the way, all that was written by ChatGPT. And I thought, well, the reason it can get away with it is it's so predictable, We're investing in the future of humanity. We believe in sustainability and diversity and equity. And so one reason that I think that things have changed a lot the last 4 years since you were last on the show is that the world has become that much narrower in what you are allowed to think, and what you should believe. And people have become more and more machine-like in what they say, whether it's relationship counselling or almost everything. There's massive consensus around everything. And therefore, it's very easy for a machine to repeat it. Because for the sake of argument, and you'll know all the clever computing and I won't, but let's say you just get say a very clever Excel spreadsheet that goes off and reads the top 50 blogs about relationship counselling. They'll all have pretty much the same bloody advice, won't they? It's like, how to get fit and healthy.
It's like Barnum statements, I guess. I think it was a psychologist called Barnum realised you could write these really bland statements that would apply to anyone, but everyone would think they were idiosyncratically applying to them, like astrology. And I don't actually agree with the political points you're making in terms of everyone's got the same opinion, but I do agree with that, when you ask it to write psychobabble, that psychobabble is psychobabble, and, ChatGPT is perfect in a situation like that. In a sense, it can write astrologies day in, day out. It can write Barnum statements day in, day out, because there isn't a competing set of views, or at least not one that people want to publicise.
Yes, and we don't want to go down the tangent because we covered this quite well with Ripjar a couple of episodes ago with 18 billion news articles. And as I was saying to Jeremy, the CEO around there, they could process those 18 billion to see how much the Overton window has changed. And his perspective or his expectation was that on 99.99% of topics, it hasn't really changed over 40 years. For example, court case reporting is court case reporting, things that actually concern them or their banks or banks that are their users. And that right at the peak, there is a narrowing of, let's say, in just the Western media as data source, there is a narrowing to almost one correct opinion on things. And then below that, you've got another thing where it's bifurcated, where you do get people who actually believe in Brexit or vote for Trump. But that's not quite as good as the opposite side. So then you've got one viewpoint, you've got two viewpoints. But actually, for the majority of what's happening in the world, it hasn't really changed was his perspective, which I agree with. But I mean, a good example would simply be this question of gold and money. So I was being too high level with my comment that everyone believes the same thing. Of course they don't. But if you want to talk about gold and money, and you look at the average economics textbook or whatever, you'll get the sort of Keynesian barbarous relic, and the Austrian school of economics is a minority viewpoint. In the same way that if you look at the Ukrainian situation, to name a painful one at the moment, you will get a very, very similar perspective from major Western media outlets. And as I spoke to my former Chinese master recently, the Chinese media, funnily enough, has got a very different perspective, and the Russian media as well. So we've got this complex structure of the information, not just at a political level, which is kind of obvious, but actually in things like economics profession, which have become dominated by one way of thinking. But anyway, so without getting bogged down into that kind of stuff, which we've thrashed around before, we started talking about this sort of generative AI thing. But let's just put that to one side for the moment. And let's say we hadn't had that sort of the chat, and I hadn't spent sort of a quarter of January playing around with it and finding use cases and exploring how to dance with it. I mean, just give a simple example. I'm thinking about doing a course on entrepreneurial governance. So I've got a book, what I wrote, and actually it turns out that if I give it a chapter at a time and ask it to summarize it into 6 things as if it were a course, that's a great way to start. Because for me to read the whole book again and to summarize it in my own mind, that's the kind of thing the human does badly. Whereas to get it to summarize chapter by chapter and say, you're a course instructor, blah, 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 then it's basically a skeleton, which I will correct because it won't have all the bones correct, and I can put the flesh on. But anyway, putting all that to one side. So if simply you just turned up and we started the podcast by saying, hey, Tristan, it's 4 years since you've been on the show talking about AI. How have things changed? What's big in 2023? So from your overview perspective, what would you say about AI in 2023 and how you're approaching it, how you'll feel about it compared to 4 years ago?
There's a lot of it, would be the first thing I would say. And because of that, I know much less about any particular aspect of it. But I think that it's now really pervasive. So people are not terrified of AI and also not held in a lure by it, which means that, there's less money to be made selling snake oil than there used to be. But also, people are less skeptical when you go and approach them with what they see now as just a more pedestrian set of tools. And would probably believe that by default you should be using AI or machine learning to solve certain problems and would question you if you weren't. And that seems to me to be more sensible. So I feel like the world has caught up with the reality of a lot of machine learning. I do feel like perhaps like a lot of people who started off with a strong technical skill set and who've sort of advanced in their careers, that I'm less on top of that strong technical skill set. But I also think that that particular technical skill set really has grown in so many directions that it's very hard to keep on top of it. And one of the reasons for that, and this is a sort of trite thing to say, is that it's so closely correlated with availability of data, cheapness of compute power, and those things have been going from strength to strength. So over the last 4 years, compute power is cheaper. What you can do on the cloud is cheaper and more sophisticated, and the data sets that you might want to work with are more prevalent. So everyone is becoming a data scientist, and everyone can become a data scientist at much lower entry costs. I think that's a good thing for everyone, really. I think it'd be unfortunate if you sort of set your career on just doing that and that only from an early age. I was lucky to sort of be a little bit earlier than this, but now it's kind of democratizing out there and everyone's taking advantage of it.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things in that, more, but just to pick out two. One of which is I think that is in itself a mark of what I see as the field being successful, in that it's no longer praised to heaven, as some of the generative stuff may be at the moment, or damned to hell. It's just kind of, oh yes, okay, so this is what you use Excel for, this is what you use Word for, and this is what you use AI for in your business, and this is this, and blah, blah, blah. The second one is that in a complex field, FS being a prime example, is that nobody knows the minutiae of, say, payments and the minutiae of trade finance. You can't, as I know, having sat at the top of the pyramid as a risk guy. You need to have, and as you as a CEO no doubt, you need to have an understanding and overview, an ability to drill down into them, even if you've got to go through, what was the language again for this kind of thing in payments. You understand the principles. But one of the things we were talking about last time was that when things just become packages in the cloud, as it were, that you call with an API, there is something quite different about an API for AI API, than there is Excel. So if I can do Excel, there's a few sums and I can see the formulae and I know what I've done. But you were flagging the concern that once it's kind of commodified, as it were.
Encapsulated.
That's the word? Okay. I was being Marxist for a change. Commodification of AI. Then there is a concern that you've got people who are using it who don't understand the hyper-complex, should we say, engine under the bonnet.
Yeah, I used to say that a lot, mostly because I was trying to protect the fact that I'd spent so much time over-educating myself in this field. And I think that is true, but in a sense it's also an indication of a poorly designed tool then. In the same sense as in Excel, you might have a function that performs a mathematical operation you couldn't do in your head or couldn't do trivially with a calculator.
Long division, probably.
Long division's not a bad example, right? We don't sit there working it out. The computer does something clever with bits and bytes and works it out for us. But there'll be, what's the cosine of something? What is the factorial? Whatever. There'll be things that are beyond a lot of people's mathematical capabilities, trivially. And Excel is clever because it tells you this is what you need to type in, this is what each parameter in this operation means, and here are some examples. And Microsoft, whether we're positive about them or not, have now designed user interfaces to these products that mean when they're encapsulated and their underlying workings are hidden away from us as users, we're protected by our own stupidity a little bit. And I think that the same is true for Google Cloud functions that might be performing AI operations or packages you can download that do them as well. That they're commodified in such a nice way. So many people have used them and interact with them that they're now perfected and as easy as they'll ever be to use. And you don't need to know what's going on underneath. I used to think you did, and I have a preference for people who know what's going on underneath and you employ them as a tiebreaker. But I don't think there's something magical about a lot of machine learning that's makes it special from other things that we're happy are abstracted away from us and we don't know how it works.
And what about this question that was a large one you've discussed before about explicability or transparency? And let's just take your day job. Let's say a client calls you this afternoon and says, "Hey, Tristan, I'm going to have to sell a ton of coffee in 6 months' time. Can I employ you guys and your clever computers to predict the price of coffee in 6 months' time?" And then you sort of delegate it to somebody, to delegate it to somebody, to delegate it to somebody. Now you're head of a vast empire. And then new graduate just uses Google Cloud AI, API, and says, "Oh, yeah, it'll be $1 million a bag." Yeah. And you ask him why. I don't know, I just did an API call. So what about that whole issue?
So explainability, as I still maintain the same line, is incredibly important. And its importance increases with the complexity of the thing you're trying to explain. But that machine learning or AI, other than it tends to be more complicated things going on underneath the hood, again, is no different to other methodologies. That's one thing I would say. There's nothing magical about it that means that it has to be more explainable than something else of equal complexity. But the other thing is, quite often you can retrofit explainability. So even if you've built something and you don't quite know how it got there, and some of them are sort of biologically informed AI methods like neural networks and deep learning are grown and trained in a way that's not directed heavily by a person. They're more organic in their growth. So the only thing you can do is retrofit an explanation to what they're doing. And that's a nice thing you can do with machine learning and AI. You can, for example, have built a model, or even someone presents you with a black box and it says, these are the inputs, this is the output. You can quite often work out what the relationships are between the inputs and the outputs without having to open up that box and tear it apart. And there's a lot of work going on out there to build explainability independently of the things you're trying to explain as a consequence, because of the importance of explainability. So yeah, they can be independent, created and used.
Right, so I mean, this isn't a good example, but as the numbers in front of me, so GPT-3 is trained on 570 gigabytes of data. Let's say GPT-3 is, I ask it to predict the coffee price. Well, there's no way that you or I could open the bonnet and look at 570 gigabytes of data and work out what it's really doing. But what you're saying is that doesn't matter, because actually it can predict the coffee price as being $1 million a bag of coffee come the autumn, and you can get approaches which will say, well, actually we can explain 80% of that away by it's looking at the weather, it's assuming inflation will be 1,000% or whatever. Is that what you're saying?
I'm not sure these approaches work with generative machine learning solutions.
Sorry, there's a bad example. I'm just saying. Okay, forget GPT, which is a red rag to the bull. Let's just say you've got a neural network. You've got a neural network. It's trained itself on 570 gigabytes of data, and it says coffee is going to be $1 million. You get another neural network that says, well, okay, well, without going through 570 gigabytes of data, what do you think its sort of main factors are here?
Yes, exactly. And that's basically what it does, is it says, well, okay, these are all the different things I can fiddle around with as knobs. Let's try all the different settings and see how sensitive the system is to me with different combinations of settings. And then that, the one on the far left has a much bigger impact than the one in the middle. So assuming you have the ability to kind of vary the inputs and see what happens to the output, you have a system where you can explain what's going on in between.
I see. So that takes me back, and this is a little while ago, to a course I did in the 1990s on neural networks, rather randomly. They had a bit of a problem getting it paid for by clients, actually. They couldn't quite see the connection between neural networks and finance. Oh, what it is to be a Cassandra and be able to see into the future. Anyway, a good definition I quite like to the neural network is that it is a non-linear function approximator. So if your first clever system basically goes away, crunches all 470 gigabytes of data, and then in its own quotes mind, unquotes, or rather implicitly, its non-linear function can be approximated by something else. What you're saying is, having got a function, something else can actually work out what that function probably is, faster than you can work out all the parameters of it in the first place, you mean, from the data?
Yes. In the case of a non-linear function, sometimes you want to find an explanation that pretends it is linear in certain places. Quite a lot of these things are a function of how simple you want the explanation to be. And that's actually quite a complicated issue. Because the more interesting black boxes aren't just taking a weighted sum of a bunch of inputs. They're doing something much more interesting and looking at interactions, and neural networks are fantastic at doing that. But if you're a human being, my view is that humans, when they like to see things explained, the default explanation of something is effectively how important something is and what direction its importance matters. Possibly ranked. People don't like to go to the next level down, which is think of interactions between those things. So quite often a kind of linear approximation to something, which sounds mathematically pretentious, but is basically a weighted sum of stuff, is the best way of explaining things to people.
Interesting. So in terms of all these various things swirling around at the moment, we've spoken about what we all know, which is that computing power keeps leaping forwards. What doesn't get so much headlines, which is that actually computer scientists are actually coming up with some clever ideas, and it's an interesting period of time for coming up with new techniques and standing on the shoulders of previous giants and getting even taller. But one of the things which we've touched on a number of times is data, whether it's
data.
18 billion at Ripjaw or 470 gigabytes for the GPT-3. And you were saying that in terms of your day job at Chai, over the last 4 years, there's been also something of an explosion, not just in computing power, not just even cleverer computer scientists, but also explosion of data sources. So
yes.
You mentioned that to me. I didn't have a clue what you actually meant.
Over a very long period of time, so it's been a constant phenomena. There's been more data available to people at lower cost, greater availability of data. I'll give you some examples. Satellite data used to be something that was very difficult to get hold of unless you were a massive systematic hedge fund who could afford to pay huge amounts of money to access it. It's now easy to get hold of satellite imagery from a lot of places systematically for free. The same goes for weather. Weather used to be a difficult thing, like to go and get historical temperatures of particular places around the world. That would have taken quite a lot of effort. Now it's something most people could do in a very short amount of time. Now you'd think, well, hang on, if you're very good at getting hold of data and have an organisation that's claiming to use all of the data that matters, etc., etc., isn't that a problem for you? Well, actually, one of the implications of data being so readily available is people don't know where to look. If you want to forecast something, obviously, my company forecasts commodity prices, but you want to forecast something, you now have the poverty of choice. You don't know which things to look at, which might drive those forecasts. And something that we've spoken about before, which I think is analogous to the hallucinations you get in generative AI, is the spurious correlations you get with big data. And that you get a kind of statistical hallucination, that there is a relationship between one data set.
Overfitting to the historic data.
Yes. And the limit, with enough data, you can kind of prove any relationship. There's a very famous website called spuriouscorrelations.org, which for some reason has it in for Nicolas Cage, and shows the number of films Nicolas Cage is in each year and how it's correlated with the number of deaths in swimming pools and things like that. Clearly there's no reason for there to be a relationship, but there is. And there's another one, which is the number of public toilets and divorce rates in Scotland.
I hesitate to wonder why that might be a correlation. Actually, a correlation scholar, but let's not talk about that.
I shudder to think. But when there is a huge availability of data, it becomes harder and harder to search for that needle in the haystack and work out what it is that you really need to look at. So it's been good for us and my career. This data is easier to get hold of, and we're very, very good at finding which bits of it are relevant. Whereas an amateur will say, great, I can get hold of this data now, but wouldn't know what to do with it.
Yes, and you remind me, I mean, it's funny, it's plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose, going back 4 decades. I remember when DataStream became available in the city, which was the first computer where you could print out historic data, and the head of equities at the time, who did like to stay late, and late in those days was about 6:30, 7. Things have changed for the worse. And he came running to me and said, look, there's this correlation between, US imports and the Japanese yen. It's virtually 100%. Look, here's this line. Like, oh, that's great, yeah. Okay, I'll keep my eye on it. A week later, it wasn't.
Yeah.
But anyway, so I'm glad that I've managed to get you around, because you have admitted that actually knowing something about all this sort of computery, sciencey, AI, MLE stuff is actually quite helpful in this particular case, because you're saying one of the trends has been that you need to know less, but still that knowing something is quite important. Otherwise, you might just come back with this overfitted thing, which sort of says the Nick Cage films do actually lead to people drowning and swimming.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's one implication. The other implication is having domain knowledge is useful. And that if you are forecasting commodity prices, knowing something about commodities might be helpful. If you work in the city and you're working with some other asset class, knowing the economic basis for a relationship bounds where you'll search. And I think that's a reassuring fact that, yes, there may be data on everything, but almost because there's data on everything, we need to know what's knitting the data together. And you don't get that without understanding how the world is formed. And I think this goes back to the ChatGPT thing. When it appears to break down is where there is some kind of common sense that hasn't been written into the fabric of what it's reading, and it misses the context and comes up with strange statements or things that people don't want to hear. I mean, I haven't really thought about it from a philosophical point of view, but you will get that with generative AI in the same way as you'll get it with big data and machine learning, supervised learning systems. You need some kind of person to sort of have a sense of structure and what's plausible a little bit. And I think in both worlds, without a human being in the loop for quite a long time, you'll either get hallucinations or spurious relationships forming.
Yes, and I wonder, having started by saying that machines are left brain in McGill-Christian terms, I wonder whether these kind of systems are not getting a little bit more right brain in a gentle fashion, which is that unlike most computer systems when they're working, which isn't often for Windows 11, but let's gloss over that one. He says painfully, which is that Excel can pretty much be trusted to do long division and get it right every time.
Yeah.
Going back to all this conflated media hysteria over ChatGPT telling someone to leave his wife and bullshit like that. Yeah, it's a system and it's not always going to be right, but you've got to use your loaf. I mean, for example, if ChatGPT had come back to me and says, well, compared to Friedman, von Mises suggested that people leave their wives rather more frequently, I think I would spot that. And again, just by learning to play and explore the system, you learn what it's used for and what it isn't. But it's a radically different, going back to, you say, the decision you made in your career, it's a radically, qualitatively different type of system from that required to fly a bloody aeroplane or one of Tesla's motor cars. You can't have something which may talk crap because it may suddenly crash you into a tree with that kind of system. But what I'm saying is that doesn't mean that if you're in that kind of world, there isn't a use case for these other things which are a billion times better than Alexa or Siri or stuff like that.
Oh, yeah. They're still very, very useful. And I mean, to be clear, I don't belittle them at all. They're absolutely incredible. I'm amazed that they exist. I wonder, though, if we're ascribing too many positive outcomes to them. I think there's a lot of hype, and I'm sceptical.
Yes, exactly. Well, that goes back to where we were 4 years ago and 7 years ago about AI as a whole. They were hyped. Everything else was promised. And if you look at Sam Altman in his talks, he does nothing but pour cold water on GPT-4 because the insane predictions that have been made about GPT-4, it's going to cure cancer and create world peace and all this kind of nonsense, which absolutely won't. But I mean, again, that's from a different perspective. And I got told in the early days of the podcast by someone, should we say, from a reputable financial publication in London, who were at the time hyping beyond all reason, peer-to-peer. And I had a private conversation with them and said, you're nuts. It's good. Who knows where it will go to? It's no way it can be that good. So, no, we know. That's what we do in the media. We hype something up and say it's the answer to everything. And then it isn't, and then we say it's complete shit. And then, 3 years after that, we'll say, well, it's something in the middle. So it's not just a deliberate media strategy, but also it's an emergent strategy because the videos that get watched on YouTube are the ones that say GPT-4 is going to have 1 trillion parameters.
Of course. I mean, that's human nature.
Human stupidity, I think.
I'm not going to read something that gives me mediocre headlines like, this thing is averagely interesting and quite good.
Yes,
obviously, that doesn't excite people.
Yes, but then it's interesting actually, because then we're talking about data and information, but then we forget very easily that we're human beings, and the data and information that we process, that we want to see, that we want to hear from the algorithms, passes through our minds.
Yeah.
So this isn't a world where robots are running robots. Good. Okay. Well, look, we've kicked a number of things around here. So in terms of, just very briefly to wrap up this section before we hear a little bit more about chai, I should have been talking about tea prices actually rather than coffee prices, I realised. But there we go. Where do you think the next few years are going? A, and then B, to the extent that 4 years ago you were missing sort of various things that have emerged. What have you learned from that experience? But first, the future, as you expected, and then secondly, the second order correction, which is, oh yes, last time I headed too far northwest, so I'll head a bit more east this time.
So I think the future, one thing we haven't spoken about is quantum. I'm a bit sceptical about emerging technologies, the kind of almost buzzword bingo that goes around them. But my limited understanding, I do think quantum aligned with machine learning AI could be quite interesting. The ability to do things in parallel.
And just for the listener who's heard of the word quantum and quantum mechanics and stuff like that, and maybe even quantum computing, what are the sort of the key takeaways? As if you're talking to the chairman of Chase Manhattan Bank, who doesn't want to know all the bloody detail, but he wants to know what it really might mean. The implication of quantum computing, from your perspective, may well be
to be able to do many things in parallel, genuinely in parallel, instead of pretending to do things in parallel, which means operations where you had to search through lots of different parameters to find the best version of a model can be done instantly, because you can run every possible version of that model in one go and then see which one's the best. That is a game changer. The most obvious example is in deciphering things.
Breaking cryptography.
Instead of brute forcing, you basically just have a go at unlocking something in one go. But there's loads of other sort of more positive implications. I think that if someone said to me, what should I study now to be hitting the next big thing in 5 to 10 years' time, that's what I'd study. That I find exciting. I am bored senseless by things like blockchain and all the stuff that goes along with that. I don't even say the words that go with it. And a lot of other emerging technologies, but I do think there's something in quantum. What was the other question?
What, if that's your central prediction, that quantum is going to be very interesting, and I agree with you. I personally don't know whether it's 5 years, 10 years or 20 years time. It's something like AI 20 years. I mean, I had a book in the 1970s on natural language processing, and it was saying blah, 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 this is how you do it, great. Well, actually, it's taken bloody, whatever, I don't know, almost 50 years to actually get somewhere in that field. I didn't know at the time whether it's going to be 5, 10, 15, 20. So quantum computing, yes, we don't quite know when, but this is a very silly question, but it's a kind of Donald Rumsfeld question. If something's going to surprise you, what is it that's going to surprise you?
What would surprise me? I think things that might surprise me is, general AI, like something that I believe is sentient for me. That would be a huge surprise to me. If people created something that passed the Turing test in very, very strict versions of it, created something we believe is sentient, that would very much surprise me. The kind of stuff we see in science fiction films.
Right. Okay. Well, we touched on that that kind of what I consider a category error in the new special podcast. I won't rehearse all that again. Suffice it to say that every wisdom tradition in the world, from people that have done things for tens of thousands of years, whether it be by meditation, whether it be by drumming, or whether it be by hallucinogens or any of these things, it's true to say that they have all, without exception, basically taken the perspective that consciousness is something in and of itself, which is sort of separate from matter. But anyway.
Yeah, dualism. Yeah, Cartesian dualism. Yeah, and I mean, I naturally sort of like to believe that consciousness is separate to the thing it's being played out in, but I can't logically see why that would be the case.
Good. Right. Okay. Well, let's get on to not coffee but chai. But before I wrap up the show, I'd like to thank all the listeners out there and my brand partner for the podcast. Smart is transforming pensions retirement worldwide. Their leading-edge retirement tech platform propelled them success in the UK. Now they're operating on 4 continents and working with partners like Zurich and JP Morgan. Find out more at www.smart.co. The enlistedboard.com, your guide to entrepreneurial governance and how you can start making your board an engine of growth today. Okay, Tristan, so maybe you'd just like to tell us a little bit about what Chai's been up to over the last 4 years, where you're going to, and what you need more of to get even bigger and better than you are today.
I would love to. Thank you, Mike. So over the last 4 years, we've built a product that forecasts raw material prices based on all these different interesting data sets and sell those forecasts to people who have physical risk. People who are not speculators, not hedge funds, speculating on the price of copper going up so they can buy some futures, but actually people who make the cars, pharmaceuticals, biscuits that we buy as consumers. And we've had great success in doing that, but I've realised that a lot of companies aren't agile enough to act on those forecasts. If you're a huge corporate, you can maybe negotiate with your supplier and say, well, this price doesn't make sense to me, I would like this price. You might buy your inventory earlier, stick it in a warehouse, or buy it later if you think the price is going to go down. Or you might be able to budget more effectively and set your prices based on our forecasts. But actually, a lot of companies can't do those things. So we're building an instrument that can transfer that price risk away, effectively an insurance product. So we can go to a large corporate, or actually any size company, and say, you make this thing out of cocoa, wheat, sugar, and plastic. When those are volatile, it's very hard to work out what your margin is going to be when you sell this product, and therefore how much you should sell it for. For this much percentage, click here, and we'll underwrite that price risk for you. So when the price of your plastic in the wrapper of your chocolate bar goes above this much per ton, we will pay you that price difference. So we're becoming a proper fintech, and not just forecasting prices, but putting our money where our mouth is and underwriting that price risk. And that's where we're going now.
So are you actual underwriters taking a principal risk, or are you brokers just laying off the transaction for a fee with some reinsurance?
The latter, to start with. So you can think of us as an MGA in the short term, where we rent the risk capital from others and get a cut of the action.
So you're more of an insurtech than you were 4 years ago?
We are very much an insurtech now, yes. In fact, that's how we think of ourselves.
Ah, how exciting. And in terms of going forwards, what do you need more of to be even bigger and better than you are today?
Risk capital, the underwriting capacity from reinsurers.
Right. So you need all the reinsurers listening should check you out and contact you this afternoon.
They certainly should. We've got a product that's uncorrelated in its returns from other asset classes and it's very profitable for a reinsurance company.
Ah, excellent. Well, I mean, there's been a number of episodes, of course, on the whole attracting capital into one sector from another sector where it's never come from in the past to get around this de-siloization, for example, wrapping up things in some kind of vehicle that, say, pension funds might be able to invest in.
Yes.
Because if, for the sake of argument, you're flogging risk to reinsurers, there's a limited number of reinsurers, they all know what the market is and they sort of say this is the kind of price. But then actually, if you can introduce a new category of investor, you can potentially get greater competition there. Anyway, that sounds very interesting. It's a nice evolution / pivot, but perhaps more of an evolution from where you were before. And I wish you every success in that and Chai going forwards.
Thank you very much, Mike. Really appreciate that. Yes, thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you're in need of a non-executive or advisory director with deep expertise, experience and contacts in the worlds of both traditional FS and fintech, or unique insight into how to make your board an engine of growth today, contact me at mike@mikeballiman.com. If you just need one-off advice in these areas, via clarity.fm/mikeballiman.
We could sit in a bend there all day, watching the firelight dance, watching the firelight dance. We could walk in the mountains before dawn, watching a happy moonrise, watching a happy moonrise. Come away from the city, but with the tarmac so dead and the people so sad. Come away from the city, but with the faces so grey, with the pain of the everyday. the mountains and the trees. Can you see what I mean? Can you see what I mean? When we fade in between the earth and the sky, kiss the city goodbye, wave the city goodbye, wave the city goodbye, wave the city goodbye. Watch the firelight dance with me, 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 watch the firelight